Let's talk about hyperinflation. This is not the same thing as inflation. If a 9% inflation rate is the equivalent of somebody jumping high enough to make a dunk on a 10-foot basketball hoop, then hyperinflation is the equivalent of jumping up to the top of a skyscraper. The most famous episode of hyperinflation is the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s. Here's a postcard from the era. Prices were rising so fast you had to keep putting more and more stamps as each of the previous stamps kept losing value. Formally, we define a hyperinflation episode when the monthly inflation rate is greater than 50%. The highest episode of hyperinflation on record is Hungary in 1945. Prices were doubling every 15 hours, nearly twice a day. For reference, during good times, we target an annual inflation rate of 2%, which is the equivalent of prices doubling every 35 years. Nearly 2 generations. Let's look at the recent history of Brazil for an example. Generally speaking, Brazil has a higher rate of inflation than the US. This chart goes from 1997 to 2022. Most of the time, the US hovers around that 2%, only recently climbing up to 8%, whereas Brazil was hovering between 5 and 8%, with a brief point up to 14% in 2002. However, this is nothing. Let's pull the graph back to 1981. Brazil was in hyperinflation. Notice that y-axis is now in the thousands of percent. You can't see any of the variation the US or Brazil has experienced since then. They peaked at over 2,500%, fell down to 500%, then peaked again at 2,000% in the early 90s. Again, we're not talking about the same thing here. So when does hyperinflation occur? This paper here put together a list of all of the hyperinflation episodes in recorded history. And we find that hyperinflation only occurs under extreme political instability. We're talking major wars like World War I or World War II, the fall of the USSR in Eastern Europe, or the French Revolution of 1795. And here's the list. Hungary at the top. This column tells us the equivalent daily inflation rate, 207%, and the time required for prices to double. And this column tells us the monthly inflation rate. Zimbabwe famously had one in 2007. Prices were doubling once every day. Yugoslavia in 1992. This is shortly after the fall of the USSR and during the significant collapse of the Yugoslavian government as the area broke into different countries. The famous German 1922 episode saw prices doubling every 3.7 days. Greece 1941 to 45, right in the middle of World War II. They had a very disruptive episode. China saw one between 1947 and 1949 in relation to their revolution. Armenia and Turkmenistan are next, early 90s, right after the fall of the USSR. Prices were doubling every 12 days for a monthly inflation rate of 438%. Peru 1990. There's the French Revolution. Prices were doubling every 15 days. Moving down the list, we see Chile had one in October 1973. This coincides with their military coup. Here's the Brazilian episode. Prices were doubling every 35 days. And at the bottom, we have Taiwan in 1947, going above that 50% monthly threshold, with prices doubling every 51 days. So let's go back to that jumping example. If a 10% inflation rate is the equivalent of making a dunk in a hoop, then the hyperinflation episode in Taiwan is the equivalent of jumping to the Singer Building, which was the tallest building in the world in 1908. What's the equivalent of jumping on top of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai? That Armenian episode of doubling prices every 12 days. How high would you have to jump to see what Hungary experienced in 1945? That would be the Himalayas at over 25,000 feet. Michael Jordan ain't making it up there in one bound. So now that we know that hyperinflation is a completely different animal than regular inflation, how do we defeat it? We'll talk about the Brazilian real. They had to change their currency 6 times in the decade between 1984 and 1994. Inflation peaked at an annual rate of nearly 3,000% in 1990, and eventually they temporarily pegged the new currency to the United States dollar. This increased the trust in banks, as folks realized when they made this deposit in the bank, no matter what the outside inflation rate was, the value of the deposit being pegged to the dollar will stay the same because the dollar was stable. This significantly slowed down the speed of transaction, culling hyperinflation. And eventually this new virtual bank deposit currency becomes the real currency, or the real. They issued so many types of currencies that they ran out of national heroes to put on it. And now their currency only features animals. Well, at least the monkey's pretty cute.